Welcome to the first in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Peggy Wargelin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress. Today we welcome Rufus Gifford, former U.S. Ambassador to Denmark during the Obama administration. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thanks, Peggy. Thrilled to be here.
How do you like to be addressed? Is it Ambassador Gifford?
Some people do that, but
Okay.
Rufus is just fine.
All right,
Rufus
thank you.
is just fine. Yeah.
Today, most of the questions will be about your knowledge and philosophy of government, as well as your strategies for making decisions and vetting information.
Great.
We'll end with a lightning round asking you to quickly comment about other issues important to our members.
Perfect.
Let's start with a 2-minute biography. What would you like voters to know about you?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a Massachusetts boy through and through. I went to Brown. I moved actually to California after I graduated from Brown and had a short stint in the entertainment industry as I was trying to find myself in this world. I found the entertainment industry to be not particularly interesting, so I quit my job in 2004 and started, because I was fed up with the state of the world, and I started volunteering full-time on John Kerry's presidential campaign. And I got hooked. Like so many of us do, I think I got hooked on politics and eventually was hired. And after he lost, I started my own business where I was trying to elect progressive candidates around the country, as well as working on issues like climate change, as well as LGBT equality. And in January 2007, I met a young African-American senator named Barack Obama. And I knew in a moment, about a 30-second conversation with him, that he is the candidate that I wanted to work for. I knew I would be spending the next year or two helping to elect him president. I had no idea that would turn into 10 years. So I worked for President Obama from January 2007 until January 2017. And the last 4 years of his administration, I was the U.S. ambassador to Denmark. I spent, as you can tell, I've spent most of my adult life trying to elect other people. But at this moment in American history, when Donald Trump was elected president, I felt like it was a time for all of us to step up our level of service. So for me, that meant coming home. For me, that meant coming home and running and putting myself on a ballot. I was so frustrated by the legacy that I think so many of us had fought for over the course of our lives and careers being fundamentally at risk with the Trump presidency. So that's why I decided to run for office and launched the campaign 8 months ago, and it's been remarkable ever since.
All right. Thank you. The first group of questions asks about your opinions about the federal government.
Sure.
So what types of programs should the federal government be responsible for?
Oh boy, where do we start with that one? So this is, broadly speaking, this is my philosophy. That we are at FDR time in American politics. And so perhaps that's a good answer to this question. Because when he's a political mentor of mine, because why do I say that, and why do I think it's so relevant today, is because he was coming out of an enormous crisis and actually entering another one, coming out of the Great Depression, entering World War II. And at the time, people had lost, the government had failed people. Of course, the government failed people during the Great Depression, and everybody knew it. So faith in government was at an all-time low. And what did FDR do? What was the New Deal all about? The New Deal was all about restoring people's faith and trust in government and politics again. And he was incredibly successful at that, both domestically and then internationally as well, as we really embarked on this remarkable 75, because he essentially set out and embarked us on this 75-year journey of American prosperity globally. And so that's the kind of government that I want to see. A government that invests in the kinds of programs, both domestically and internationally, that gives people faith and trust in government once again. What we have been seeing since the 80s, in my mind, is a slow and steady step backward, that we're cutting programs. Since Ronald Reagan essentially said that you should not trust the federal government, since those days, those domestic programs have been cut and cut and cut and cut. So in my mind, we need to invest in them. And whether that is Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, whether that are programs associated with affordable housing. We have in Housing and Urban Development Secretary right now that is only cutting affordable housing programs where we are seeing enormous housing crises. In our cities, and you say things like student loans. during, again, this kind of remarkable chapter of American history that I've been talking about, we invested in things like the GI Bill, which essentially said you serve your country and you get a free college education. That's the big ideas that I'm talking about. And those are the big ideas that I think we need to be investing in at the federal government level. I could go on, but that's sort of a basic breakdown of how I feel about these issues.
Thank you. Could you describe one program run by the federal government you feel is especially successful and effective, and explain why you think that is so?
Oh boy, one program. Yes, I mean, so you mean an agency or a specific program? That
completely up to you.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about, so I'll go towards, let me do one foreign and perhaps one foreign and one domestic, if you don't mind. So largely speaking, the idea of USAID, foreign aid, is a critical component of what of the American brand globally. So I'll give you some examples of that. And foreign aid has a terrible reputation. It's one of those things that, politically speaking, is very controversial because it seems like we are giving money to other countries where we could be spending it domestically. But let me give you examples of why this is so good. Yeah. Let's look at things like PEPFAR. PEPFAR was a George W. Bush initiative, which essentially was spending millions of dollars to help rid the continent of Africa of HIV and AIDS. Yep. This was at a time when you could see as high as 50% infection rates in some of these African countries. And you needed American investment, American leadership to actually try to really solve this global or at least continental crisis. Right. So that's a program that I think is incredibly valuable. But aid more broadly, think about it. So we are seeing, Donald Trump talks over and over again about these caravans of people from Central America coming up and trying to enter our country. Well, that is a problem. It is a problem that you have so many people being displaced because of crime in their home countries. Right. So if you were to help try to promote democracy and rule of law in places like Honduras and El Salvador, perhaps you could prevent these crises. So foreign aid actually cuts off should help solve the problem at its source. You could see this happening, theoretically, having lived in Europe during the Syrian migration crisis. Same thing. If we had figured out how to stabilize politically the situation on the ground, you would not have seen the enormous influx of Syrian refugees coming into Europe in 2015. So that's why foreign aid is so important. Really so important. Domestically, so there's so much to choose from here, I think. I just think you have to go towards because I think they're always on the chopping block. I think you have to go to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And the other side, meaning the Republicans, constantly talk about cutting. And I'm sure at times you can make programs more efficient. I've worked for the federal government and I understand it's not necessarily the most efficiently run organization, bureaucracy. But that being said, we cannot be cutting services. We have to understand that when you're traveling around this great district that I'm hoping to represent in Congress, people rely on it. People rely on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security for their livelihoods, for their health, and in some ways, these programs keep people alive, keep people off the streets, and this is something. These social safety net programs are vitally important to the health of our society. So I can't stand it when I see the political opposition say we need to cut. No. Again, it's not about, I'm sure we can figure out ways to be more efficient, but let's strengthen these programs. Let's understand that we should actually be expanding access, just like we did with Medicaid under Obamacare. And we need to actually keep moving in that direction and not talking about cutting services. That's a very long answer, but it's a broad question, so I could go on and on.
No, exactly. Part of it is to see how do you interpret the question.
Of course,
so it's lovely. Okay, so now could you describe a federal program you feel is not successful? And what improvements would you suggest to it?
Well, gosh, this is now, in this day and age, it's whether it's a federal program or a policy. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump's immigration policy is is massively flawed to me. So, you know, this is something where I believe we have to think about who we are as a country and a people. So when I think about immigration, we have to remember what is written on the Statue of Liberty. We have to remember, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And then you have Donald Trump say things like, we don't want immigrants from Nigeria and Haiti, we want them from Norway. Well, I have a message for the president. Having lived in Scandinavia, they're not coming. They're fine. The problem is that the United States, since our founding, has been a shining beacon of hope for oppressed people around the world. Even presidents, Republican presidents like Ronald Reagan, espoused this concept that the United States is, again, a shining beacon of hope for oppressed people around the world. He would have found Donald Trump's immigration policy to be hateful and xenophobic and racist, I believe. And so the direction we are turning on this is really, really troubling. So I'm very, very disturbed when I see, I mean, it's obvious. I think we're all disturbed about the stories of immigration officials separating families at borders. I'm happy to see that policy has come to an end. But at the same time, look, I'm hearing yesterday was the deadline to reunite children under 5 with their parents, and the government couldn't meet that. I find this to be a humanitarian crisis. And so to me, this is a program, to answer your question.
Sure.
So whether it's the way ICE is functioning, whether it's Customs and Border Patrol, whether it's the basic functions of DHS. Now, I'm a believer in this. Having worked with ICE agents, having worked with DHS officers as ambassador, this is about policy more than anything. And that policy comes from the top. And as far as I'm concerned, that reform, which I certainly support, has to come from the policy space and from the top. And one of the reasons why I'm running for Congress right now.
Sure, sure. Okay. When do you think it's appropriate to make use of private sector resources like outsourcing and public-private partnerships for government functions?
Yeah. Well, it depends. I think that the private sector does have a role. I'll give you sort of one big global example and then one very local example in the 3rd District. The first example I would say is the Paris Climate Agreement. So the Paris Climate Agreement was something that I worked on peripherally. I didn't help negotiate, but it was certainly, I was ambassador at the time we were negotiating this, and Denmark was a great partner of ours in the climate agreement, and I worked with the chief negotiator, whose name was Todd Stern, came to Denmark a number of times over the course of my ambassadorship. And what was really interesting about the Paris Climate Agreement is we got every country to sign on, and there was a big public investment in helping make the planet greener. But there was also an enormous private investment led by Bill Gates that was really a one-to-one match on the U.S. side. So understanding that the private sector does have a role to play, that in some ways I would argue right now in the United States, the private sector is ahead of the public sector on green energy, investment in renewable energy. So I think that, like, given that example, I think the government has to have skin in the game, meaning they have to be investing in publicly. But I also think the private sector has a role to play. And so let me go local on this. I look at a city like Fitchburg, Massachusetts, which is a great city, had a tremendous amount of wealth at some point years back, and it's obviously in recent years fallen on hard times. If you go down Main Street, we have an office right on Main Street in downtown Fitchburg, but maybe every 3rd or 4th storefront is vacant, and has been for some time. And when you think about investment back in Fitchburg, how do we bring this Main Street back to its full potential? To me, this is the perfect opportunity for both public money as well as private investment. So if we are going to rebuild, reinvigorate so many of our smaller cities and towns, to bring businesses back, small businesses, keep students, figure out ways to get young people downtown at cafes and coffee shops and arts districts and things like that. This has got to be a combination of public and private to me, that we all need to be working together. I like to say that I'm a former diplomat, and I like to say that we need more diplomacy in politics. It was my job for 4 years to sit around the table with the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit community, and get us all to, we may disagree, we may be coming at it from a different perspective, but how can we all have interests in making our cities thrive again? So how can we should be sitting down with the federal government, the state governments, the local governments, together with the nonprofit community and the private sector. And let's think about how we can all invest in our communities. So I think that's a great example of how public-private partnerships can work quite well.
Great. All right. And then last question on the federal government. What federal government programs have you or members of your extended family benefited from?
Oh, boy. I certainly, the truth is, what's the biggest? Certainly, I've been someone who has been lucky to have been born with a certain amount of financial security, and with that comes really, in my mind, a great responsibility. And when my mom and dad taught me as a little kid that when you are born into that situation, that you simply must give back, that this idea that this is not, that you can't take this stuff for granted, and that our society relies actually on that sort of philanthropy, on the idea that those who are born with certain financial security need to do everything they can to make society better for other people. So that's how I think about that question. I do. Of course. I'm personally on Obamacare right now, so I suppose I'm benefiting from that.
Sure.
But and I'm a huge believer. I'm part of the team that helped pass Obamacare. My husband is certainly a beneficiary of the public school systems in the state of Massachusetts. He grew up in Waltham. I don't know if he's the beneficiary of this or not, but he had certainly many federal student loans. It took him until he was 50 years old to pay them off, and I think that's a problem, not necessarily a positive thing. But it allowed him, the federal student loan program allowed him to go get higher degrees and whatnot, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Okay.
All
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so this next set of questions is about how you obtain and use information.
Great.
So what is a fact to you, and how are facts important in your decision making?
Oh boy. What is a fact? I think a fact is something grounded in science, right? The fact is something grounded in something that can be independently verified, if that makes sense, right? If something that is something that it's something that probably several or more people admit is true, and verified by science somehow. And everything about that is important. In a time where I think there's so much false information out there, it's critically important for us to be grounded in truth. And some people say, how do you counteract fake news? Well, in my mind, the way you counteract fake news is to just speak the truth, and speak the truth louder and more louder and more consistently. That's the only way you can combat lies and falsehoods. And I do fear that in this chapter of American politics, that we are we are paying more attention to falsehoods, lies, whatever you may want to call them. And how do we fight it? We just have to speak the truth. We have to call it out, and call it out more loudly than the lies are being told.
Okay. Do you verify information that's provided to you? And how do you decide what sources of information to trust?
Oh, it's a great question. So it's really interesting. At this point, over the course of my life, I used to watch, say, very politically slanted cable news. I would watch MSNBC for the entire night and get a lot of my information that way. Even though I politically agree with what many of the commentators on MSNBC are saying right now, I don't watch it. And why don't I watch it? It's because I am a huge believer in popping your bubble. So, meaning that we somehow have to get out of the echo chamber of agreement and when I watch, and I have great respect for all of the, Rachel Maddow and Chris Matthews and everybody who's on, but I find myself just nodding and throwing something at the TV from time to time and that just doesn't, that's not particularly constructive for me, and not judging anybody who loves that. In fact, most of my friends and family do. But for me, I try to take emotion out of the information that I'm receiving because I think everything right now is so emotionally charged. So let's read the facts. Let's understand what's happening out there. And I think just the kind of more unbiased assessments of what's happening on the ground without the emotion can still get you fired up without the editorializing, right? So I'm a huge, so I love, what do I read? I love the New York Times. A lot of people on the right would say it's biased. I would not agree. Obviously the editorial pages and whatnot are left-leaning. I love the Washington Post. I think they're doing some great reporting right now. Some of the best journalism that I've seen since Watergate. I was born in 1974, so we're seeing that great investigative journalism from the Post once again. Depending on there's and I love the Atlantic. Of course, I read the local news as much as I possibly can as well. But it really is a variety of different sources. And it's funny. I'm going back to watching 60 Minutes and the 6:30 national news. If I can, I usually tape the 6:30 national news and 60 Minutes and see what I can do to watch them over the course of my week, just to catch up on daily stories.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. How do you communicate with people who trust different information sources than you do?
Oh boy, this is a hard one. But it's so important. So important. I think that first of all, you got to get them to the table, right? So how do you get someone who just believes in that everything Fox News says is accurate? Now, I don't know. So I'll give you examples of what I did as ambassador, because in the American because we are so much more polarized than Denmark is. But I would constantly try to sit down with people who I did not understand. And I was coming at it from a very sort of neutral position when I was ambassador. But think about it. There are 9 political parties in Denmark. There's a far-right, xenophobic, anti-immigrant party, and there's a far-left, sort of former communist, very anti-capitalist party. And I might have very different, I do not agree politically with either party. But it was my job to sit down with them. That's what the job is, to try to get all of these parties, or at least a majority of them, to agree on a variety of different initiatives, whether that is removing chemical weapons from Syria or fighting climate change, whatever it may be. And that was a fascinating experience for me. I will always disagree at the bottom of my heart with the immigration politics of many of these nationalistic parties in Europe. They're actually, I believe, educated Donald Trump. But you do have to get a sense somehow of why people feel that way. And it is grounded in reality. It's not exclusively racist. There's definitely that, but there is this sense of insecurity. There's a sense that the system is failing. And whether that is a sort of social safety net system or the immigration policy or whatever, the system is failing so that the traditional forms of government are not providing the same level of service that they used to. And there's a real anxiety about that. And because of that, people place blame. And where do they place blame? They place blame on, and we've done this for generations now, place blame on immigrants and globalization in essence. So things, and because you're never going to blame what's happening locally for the most part, that's still okay. But it's the kind of otherness, it's an easy scapegoat. So it was really interesting for me to understand that, because once you do understand it, you can start to have the conversation that you ask. Once you do it, you can say, well, listen, if I were to sit down with a far-right political party in Denmark that was very anti-immigrant, understanding where they're come from, and I could tell I could tell a story about American immigration policy and how, even considering the current situation, we are still the best example of successful immigration policy in the history of the world. And so that's a really fun conversation, but you have to understand where they're coming from first. Right. And so that's how I'm running this campaign, is this idea that we have to understand that if you go to parts of this district, if you go to, say, northern Worcester County, Fitchburg, Gardner, places like that, there are parts of this district that feel significantly left behind by the growth. The greater Boston area has experienced great prosperity, especially since the end of the Great Recession. And that has not come to other parts of this district. It has not come to Lawrence. It has not come to the Worcester County part of this district. And we have to understand that. And so many of us live in this kind of this bubble around the cities, and this kind of intellectual liberal bubble. And that's fine to a certain extent, as long as you are willing to pop it and understand what is happening in some of the other cities and towns in this district. And that's why I'm in this. It's to make society work for everybody, not just for the people who are prospering, who are feeling the effects of the recovery, because not everybody's feeling the effects of the recovery. So it's trying to get a sense of what they are experiencing, and then you can have a conversation about changing their minds politically. Sure. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
All right. So let's move on to the specific elected position that you were running for.
Yes, great.
So why do you want to be the U.S. representative for Massachusetts District 3? I think you've answered it a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I'll try to be brief, because I know I've been long-winded, as I always am, because I get very fired up about these questions.
Sure.
So listen, when Donald Trump won the presidency, and I've said this already, I was fundamentally concerned about the erosion of the American system, that what I believe actually made America great is these, from the end of World War II, essentially from the beginning of World War II to the present. And I think in recent years we've been slowly eroding some of the things that actually made America great. And Donald Trump is trying to do everything he can to erode everything else, meaning erode some of these great alliances. He's in Brussels today at this NATO summit, where he is actually he has essentially said that he doesn't believe that NATO is relevant. I could not disagree more. This says NATO has been responsible for probably more peace and prosperity in the last 75 years than any other international organization. And so I'm very concerned about the direction of the country. But what I am interested in more broadly is how I can take that experience that I have, that perspective that I have, both nationally and internationally, and actually try to help people on the ground. So to me, this is about returning politics back to its purest form, its human form. It's about public service once again, understanding that people need help. Our society right now is struggling in a number of different ways, whether that is our crumbling roads and bridges, our abysmal public transportation system, the opioid crisis, the cost of healthcare, the cost of education, the cost of housing, the fact that wages are not rising, all of these issues. And when you travel to these 37 cities and towns in the 3rd District of Massachusetts, you see this stuff firsthand. You knock on people's doors, you hear their stories, you hear their heartbreaking stories, from everything from the opioid crisis to the fact that they can't support their ailing mother or father, and you just realize that, look, we've got to make the system work for people. And I know I'm only one guy, I know that, but I want to do this. I want to fight for them, this is just what I want to do. I want to make people believe in this country again. I want to make government work for people. I want to make government not a dirty word, as it has been, I think, in so much in recent years. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. And then, so how long have you lived in the district?
I moved here. So Concord. So I lived in, so I moved back from Washington. I moved back from Copenhagen in 2017. And then did a lot of traveling in 2017, but Concord was actually the first place I lived permanently when I moved back from Copenhagen. But I also
Okay.
understand. Look, I've been gone for a long time, and that means that again, as I say, I'm a Massachusetts boy through and through. But I know that means that I have to reintroduce myself to the people of the district, and that's why, even though my family is here, we're in Concord Carlisle High School, where my nieces and nephews have gone to school, and my aunts and uncles and cousins and whatnot have gone to school here and live in these communities. I understand that I'm a new face to many people, and that's why I have to spend, in what I say is I have to outwork everybody. I have to be the first person to show up and the last person to leave.
This is a very diverse district.
Yes.
How do you plan to represent the interests of people with such varying concerns and views of what government can and should do?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and this is something. It's why this is a remarkable district. So you may spend the morning in Lawrence, the lunchtime in Concord, and the evening in Gardner. Right. These are three remarkably different communities, right? And you have to understand, and this is why it's such a good. This race is so important, and because we have to understand how to communicate with everybody. We have to understand the needs and concerns of every community in this district. I'm running this race in all 37 cities and towns. Some people may decide to just run up the vote in one community. No, I think we have to run district-wide if we're going to serve this entire community. But ultimately it is about this. It is about what I said before. When you ask how can you serve the needs and interests of this diverse community. Ultimately, it is about those basic economic bread and butter issues. So it's about good paying jobs. It's about jobs that actually pay a decent wage. It's about trying to bring some of these manufacturing jobs back to the district. The first policy plan that I rolled out was a very extensive green jobs program. So this is, I'm a huge believer in renewable energy. I've done a lot of work on this issue. Denmark is 40% renewable, and that's wonderful, not only because it saves the planet, but it also is a job creator, and it's an economic driver. And we can be bringing these jobs back to this district. I was meeting just last week with this Danish company that is in the process, or they were just awarded the contract to build the first commercial scale offshore wind farm in the country, just south of Martha's Vineyard, which is great. What's fun about this is that you have to build these things somewhere, and you can imagine the components that go into them. So these are all built right now in Europe because we don't have any offshore wind farms. So we can actually build these locally. And that's what's exciting to me. Think about the jobs that you can create. So if I am in Lawrence, or if I am in Gardner, or if I am in Concord, frankly, everybody is interested in that. It saves the planet. It's good middle-class union jobs to actually do something to truly rebuild the middle class. And it's an economic driver. It revitalizes. Theoretically, if we bring jobs back to northern Worcester County, or wherever it may be, anywhere from Haverhill to Winchendon and the upper swath of this district, you can imagine the local businesses thrive as well, because we get people moving back to these communities. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
Sure. All right. What concerns do you hear from voters most often, and what are the issues you're most concerned about personally?
Yeah. I think the thing that comes up most, and it will depend on where you are, but the issue that comes up most will be just this basic issue of economic insecurity. So this idea that we have less money to spend. Wages are not increasing, while at the same time costs are increasing. And that may sort of manifest itself. Those conversations may be about healthcare. It may be about prescription drugs. You hear about that a lot. You hear about student loans. If you're with young people, you hear about student loans. You may be with older people. You hear about prescription drugs. People in the middle, maybe housing. But it's all the same concept. It's all about the fact that we are incurring more debt. And we don't have enough money to spend. So that is that I think is just the basic concern of most people in this district, and how do we solve that? Because that's a big issue. That's why I think you go back to this New Deal style politics. We need big ideas at times when the crisis is as considerable as it is. And as far as what concerns me specifically, all of these issues, climate change is absolutely a huge issue for me. Basic issues of equality as a married gay man, the idea that the new Supreme Court could take away federal marriage rights is terrifying to me. just sort of those basic fundamental principles. So much of the progress that I think that we had made socially over the course of the last several decades could be eroded. All of those issues are concerns.
Sure.
I think it's hard not to be concerned about a number of the about sort of the general trajectory of society right now.
Please tell us about how you're financing your campaign.
Yeah. Oh boy, yeah, this is one of those things that I cannot stand. So as much as I love this campaign, I do. I really do. But my least favorite part is the fact that you have to raise money in order to run it. And you have to raise money in order to be competitive. And there is too much money even in this presidential primary, congressional primary right now. I would love to see a time when we had public financing of campaigns. Anybody who looks you in the eye and tells you that money is not a corrupting influence in politics, I think is lying to you. I fully support overturning Citizens United, and even doing more than that. It's problematic. I can sit here and look you in the eye and say that not a single person who has given me a dime in this campaign expects anything from me other than to advocate for the exact same concepts, policies that I articulate on the campaign trail every day. But it is frustrating. I mean, it is frustrating that you have to do this. You spend so much of the time that you want to spend on the road talking to voters. Oftentimes, you have to spend in a small room making phone calls to, and 80% of the people either don't answer the phone or tell you no. And that's it's just, but it's it's part of the world. But you got to win if you're going to change the system, and that's the problem. You got to play by the rules in order to win, and then if you win, maybe you can impact change once you get there.
Sure. All right, and then let's see. What are your criteria for accepting or declining contributions?
Oh, obviously I would take no NRA money. The oil companies, tobacco companies, I just wouldn't do. First of all, they wouldn't give to me, so I would say I wouldn't be particularly concerned. In a congressional primary, the truth of the matter is the vast majority of people who are giving to you are part of your personal network. Okay. So, and when I say that, the vast majority of people who are funding my campaign are people who are part of the Obama network, because I worked for the president for 10 years, the national LGBT community, the diplomatic community, meaning the foreign policy community, who truly think that we need more foreign policy experts in Congress, because so often, and for good reason, a lot of our junior Congress people are coming from the local level, so they don't have any global perspective, and so they are certainly supporting my campaign. And then increasingly people continue locally, increasingly people from the district, and certainly but I really do feel like I've had to earn a lot of this. That it's been a lot of phone calls, a lot of knocking on doors, but I haven't been in a position where somebody whose politics I despise has wanted to, or is somehow contradictory to what I want to be, has wanted to invest in my campaign. I think people know that this is the truth. I have a pretty long record, so people know what I stand for, and people know the kind of congressperson that I want to be, and those are the people who are investing in my campaign.
Okay. National politics is increasingly marked by rancor and division, and dealing with this will be a large part of the job. Describe a past situation where you had to work to get something done with a group of people who strongly disagreed with your position.
Oh boy, yeah. Strongly disagreed. So I'll talk about me, because this is truly the issue. The concept that we're talking about is what you do every day as ambassador. Right. So the idea is, I mean, these are kind of big issues, but I'll explain to you one of the things that we worked on. So we, as the United States government, were trying to do everything we could to get Danes to lead an operation to remove chemical weapons from Syria. Okay. That meant that I mentioned these 9 political parties a bit earlier. That meant that I had to sit down with the leadership of all 9 political parties, some of whom were inherently supportive of this initiative, very sort of pro interventionist, very pro-global, it felt like Denmark, even with its 5.7 million people, quite small, needed to do everything they could to export freedom, peace, prosperity, whatever you may want to say. So these parties would be inherently positive. But then that didn't mean that it was 50% of parliament, because we needed to rely on a parliamentary vote. So we had to go in and talk to folks, talk to other parties who might not necessarily agree with us, and talk to them about why this mattered so much. So strongly disagree with us, we probably couldn't get them. They probably wouldn't vote for us, vote along with the majority if they strongly disagreed with us. But this was about sitting around a table. This was about negotiating. This was about talking about the true value here, making sure that Danish troops wouldn't be put significantly in harm's way. How can we ensure that costs were not going to spiral out of control? How do we provide enough international support so that this wasn't just rely strictly on Danes and Danes only? What was the United States going to do to help support this initiative? And we got there, and that's the wonderful thing, is that it wasn't always easy. Sometimes we had to go back to various parties from time to time, and it meant a lot of conversations with the Minister of Defense and the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister at the time. But we got there, and so those are examples, I think, that when you are ambassador, that you are faced with every day. You will oftentimes have people who strongly disagree with you, but you still sit down and talk to them. Why not?
Sure.
Why would you not do that? Yeah.
Okay, and then the last official question is, what is your philosophy on legislative compromise?
So compromise is one of those words in politics that has like sort of this nasty, or almost a bad brand in this day and age, because compromise could mean compromising your values, right? So essentially, you are going to do something that is a compromise of something that is inherently part of what you stand for. I believe you can still get legislation done that does not compromise your values by working across the aisle. Like, I don't believe immigration policy should be inherently partisan. I think that it wasn't that long ago that we had something like the Gang of Eight that was actually working towards comprehensive immigration reform in a bipartisan way, with border state Republican senators understanding that we have to do something about this. Infrastructure should not be an issue that should be inherently partisan. And I think that, again, we can work with Republicans to actually get big bills like this done. Opioids, green jobs. I believe I could sit across the table from the most conservative Republican congressman from Texas and get him to help me work on more federal incentives to encourage the development of green jobs. States like Texas, states, in the Southwest in general, there's so much sun and wind. They understand that the future, many do at least, understand that the future is about renewable energy. Not only is it good for the planet, but it's a job creator. And I think we can make that case. So I do think about working across the aisle very much, but I don't believe in compromising my values ever. I do not believe in compromising my values. So that's where I think the concept of compromise, the word can be twisted in that way. We come from a long line of politicians in this wonderful state that we live in. People like Tip O'Neill, who was a good Democrat, a great progressive, who would still work with Ronald Reagan to move the country forward. Teddy Kennedy, of course, one of my political heroes, still worked with people like Orrin Hatch, still worked with people like George W. Bush, because these are statesmen and women, as far as I'm concerned, on our side, that actually wanted to do what they could in order to move the country forward. And I don't believe they were ever compromising their values.
Cool. All right, so finally, let's touch quickly on some other issues important to our members.
Great.
And you've touched a little on some of them, but I'm thinking, just give a quick response to each issue.
Sure.
Women's right to choose.
Oh, 100%.
Health care.
Medicare for all.
Okay. Civil rights.
Obviously enormously complex.
Yep.
We may never achieve full equality in this country. We can maybe do it legislatively, but the moment we believe that the civil rights of all people is achieved is the moment we start slipping in the wrong direction. So we have to understand that we need to keep marching towards a more equal society. And this is not just about legislation.
Yeah.
I'd love to see criminal justice reforms and whatnot, which is certainly in my mind connected to civil rights.
Yeah.
And it's also issues connected to poverty are also connected to civil rights. And this is also moving into issues like equal pay for women, transgender rights. We have to continue to march in this direction and never take our foot off the gas.
Sure. Net neutrality.
I again, as a student of as an alum of the Obama administration,
Yes.
you probably understand how I feel about this one.
Yes. Gun regulations.
I am this is this one that drives me crazy. I think we need a ban on assault weapons. I think we need universal background checks. You can't help, as we've all lived through Columbine and Newtown and Orlando and Las Vegas and now Parkland, and we still have had Congress do nothing. Nothing. They can talk a big game from time to time. The NRA outlasts us. This is the perfect example of why people don't have faith and trust in government. Is we have the majority of this country who would support a ban on assault weapons, and yet we still can't get anything done. We can't even get a ban on bump stocks, for God's sake. So it's frustrating as can be.
The latest round of tax cuts.
Oh, I think it's disastrous. I truly think, look, I've been marching with striking workers a couple of times over the course of the last week. Look, we were promised, people may have seen a little bit more money in their paychecks over the course of the last several months, maybe. But we are also seeing record corporate profits, while and had been promised that those record corporate profits would actually trickle down to workers. And we are not seeing that at the rate that I believe that we are promised. And so I think the first thing we got to do as far as this as far as taxes are concerned is repeal this tax cut and start over. And we also think like this is something where tax policy actually has to somehow be bipartisan because it has to be long lasting. Yeah. It has to stick. The problem we have here is that bill in particular, it passed without a single Democratic voice. Not even a public hearing. Not even a hearing where Democrats were allowed to weigh in. And that is, you cannot pass something as important as tax reform in a hyper-partisan way, because it just means the next time the pendulum swings, and it will, I hope it will, you're going to deal with the same situation. And I believe our fiscal policy needs to be a bit more stable than that.
Cool. Government policy for the situation in Puerto Rico.
Oh, you mean Hurricane Maria specifically, or statehood, or whatever?
Anything that you want to discuss.
So so I first of all, I would support Puerto Rican statehood, by the way. I know that's a complex situation. I'm not sure that Republicans would ever support that, but I would. The issue about Hurricane Maria is tragic. Again, it's a great example of the failure of the federal government to actually step in when they needed to. And I do believe I blame the Trump administration for this. He goes to San Juan, throws toilet paper at people, and essentially pats himself on the back and says, "Look at how great a job we did." And when we realize now people still are without power, some people are still without water, or clean water at least, and people are still dying as a result of Hurricane Maria. So it's a great failure. And I believe that if you did have, I believe that if Puerto Rico was in essence a state, you would have seen a more aggressive federal response. And it's troubling in every way, and I hope that we don't forget. I hope we don't. In some ways, it's sad to think that if you are a Puerto Rican, if you live on Puerto Rico, you can't vote in the United States. And does that somehow impact our policy? And I think that's scary. I think that these people are Americans, and the idea that we somehow treat them differently is very, very sad. And you see this in our district here. You have so many displaced foreign Puerto Rican families that are living in places like Lawrence and Fitchburg. So it matters, and because it does put a strain. If we fail like we did on Hurricane Maria, it actually impacts all of our communities.
Yep. Our immigration policy.
Yeah. We talked about this already.
Yeah.
I find it to be un-American. I do.
Yeah.
I also know, look, I believe fully that we need to be a system of law and order. But what we are doing right now is an immigration policy that's rooted and grounded in xenophobia and I believe racism as well. So whether it's the Muslim ban or the wall or the separation of families or the ICE raids, this forgets what it means to be American. The fact that our president doesn't remember that his ancestors came to this country hoping for the same sorts of things that immigrants are coming for now, and he achieved the American dream in every way. His family achieved the American dream in every way, and I think it's offensive, in essence, to say that. To prevent that somehow. When I see that, I don't know if you've seen this story recently, that we are kicking immigrants who join the army, enlist in the army, have been they get sort of fast track citizenship. These are legal citizens. These are legal residents. Fast track citizenship, which makes sense. It's the same idea as you serve the country, you give back to the country, perhaps you should get expedited citizenship. And the fact that they are essentially going back on their word on this and kicking people out of our armed forces, so un-American to me. Don't get me started on this stuff, because it really does hit to the heart of who we are as a country. And this is where you do believe that Donald Trump is trying to undermine everything that actually made America great. And this is, and whether we're talking DACA or we're talking about the issue in the military right now, or the ICE raids, or the separation of families, or the Muslim bans, it's just all of it feels, you just shake your head. Yeah.
Okay, and then campaign finance reform.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'm a signer of America's Promise, which is actually Concord-based organization that's looking to overturn Citizens United. And I would be 100% supportive of that, and I actually think we need to go further. I oftentimes look at Massachusetts, and our campaign finance laws in the state of Massachusetts are some of the best, in my mind, in the country. The limits are low, and the regulation is quite high. And if you look at some of the other, I've worked in other states too, and it's much more of the wild, wild west. And special interests can absolutely work themselves into the system. They can work their way into the system in most places, including Massachusetts. But you can regulate more and more. McCain-Feingold was a good law, an absolutely good law. And as it's slowly eroding, based on Supreme Court decisions, I think it's tragic, and we just need to, well, honestly, we need a new Supreme Court probably, but there's probably some legislation we can invest in as well to clean it up.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions. It's so nice to get to hear you answer for longer than the minute-and-a-half soundbite kind of things you usually get to do.
Absolutely. Well, this was so fun. I really appreciate it, Peggy. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye-bye. So thank you again for watching the first in our series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas. I'm Peggy Wargelin, and this has been brought to you by Concord Citizens Protecting Progress.